They said the girl had sinned. That she needed to be shown her place in front of God and man. It was a blistering summer Sunday in the small town of Redemption Creek, and the whole town had gathered outside the old wooden church. The air shimmered in the heat, the dust dry as bone underfoot. The whitewashed walls of the church seemed to glow under the punishing sun, almost too bright to look at. The preacher's voice rang out like a hammer striking steel, each word heavy with judgment as he read the charges against her: pride, disobedience, temptation. Mary Ellen stood in front of the crowd, her wrists bound tight with a coarse rope that bit into her skin. Her eyes were fixed on the ground, her dark hair hanging loose over her face. Her pale dress, once neat and modest, was torn from when the deacons dragged her out of her small rented room that morning. The townspeople stared, some curious, some with hard eyes. A few women whispered to one another behind gloved hands, their faces pale in the glare of the sun. The whip cracked once in the air, a sharp, violent sound that made even the guilty turn away. They said this was discipline, but everyone knew it was punishment meant to break her. The man holding the whip adjusted his stance, his arm steady, his expression blank as stone. The first strike landed across her back, the leather tearing cloth and skin in one merciless stroke. A hiss escaped her lips, but she bit back the cry that wanted to follow. The second blow came quicker, harder, making her knees tremble. A bead of sweat rolled down her temple, but she kept her eyes lowered, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her fall apart. Among the crowd, leaning on the hitching rail outside the general store, stood a man no one quite knew. A tall figure in a dust-brown duster coat, his wide brim hat casting a deep shadow over his face. His jaw was cut sharp like the edge of a knife, his hands resting loose but ready at his sides. Nobody in Redemption Creek had heard him speak a single word. They called him the Silent Cowboy, and some said he had ridden in from the borderlands where trouble clung to men like dust on boots. The third lash fell, and Mary stumbled forward. Her knees hit the dirt hard, sending up a puff of dust that clung to the sweat on her skin. The crowd let out a collective gasp, some stepping back, others leaning in as though watching a show. And then, everything stilled. Boots crunched slowly over the dirt. The Silent Cowboy began to walk toward her. Each step was deliberate, slow, like a man who knew the weight of his presence. Conversation stopped. The preacher's voice faltered mid-sentence as he realized the stranger wasn't stopping. "This is God's house, sir," the preacher began, but the cowboy didn't spare him so much as a glance. The whip holder tightened his grip, lifting the leather to strike again, but the cowboy's shadow fell over him. Without a word, the stranger reached out and grasped the handle of the whip. His grip was steady, not forceful at first, but the way his eyes locked onto the man's was enough to make him freeze. In one smooth motion, the cowboy took the whip from his hand and tossed it into the dust. Then, drawing a small hunting knife from his belt, he cut through the ropes around Mary's wrists. The fibers snapped apart, leaving raw red marks on her skin. Mary lifted her gaze for the first time, meeting his eyes. They were deep and unreadable, like the dark water of a river that ran too deep to see the bottom. He didn't speak, didn't even nod, but there was something in the way he stood, a quiet promise that no more harm would touch her while he was there. The crowd shifted uneasily. Whispers rose like the wind through dry grass. The preacher shouted about interference and the law of the town, but no one stepped forward to stop him. The cowboy placed a steady hand at Mary's elbow, guiding her to her feet. His touch was firm but gentle, careful of her wounds. They walked through the gathered townsfolk, their path parting like water around a stone. Mary could feel their eyes on her, some burning with judgment, others with fear. No one dared block the cowboy's path. When they reached the edge of town, she thought he might leave her there. But instead, he led her to his horse, a black stallion, powerful and restless under the sun, its dark eyes reflecting the same calm strength as its rider. Without asking, the cowboy lifted her into the saddle. Then he swung up behind her, the leather creaking under their weight. They rode away from Redemption Creek, the church shrinking in the distance. The town's voices faded into nothing but the sound of hooves against dry earth. Mary clutched at the saddle horn, the wind cooling the sweat on her face. She didn't know where they were going, and strangely, she didn't need to. Hours passed before the cowboy slowed his horse. They stopped at a grassy rise where the land opened wide under the sinking sun. He dismounted, tying the reins loosely to a low branch, then reached into his coat and handed her a canteen. The water was warm from the day's heat, but it soothed her cracked lips and dry throat like rain after a drought. She wanted to speak, to ask why he had helped her. But when she met his gaze, something inside her told her the answer wasn't meant for words. His eyes held a story of their own, one she couldn't quite read, but knew was carved deep with loss and experience. They stayed there until the light turned gold, and the long shadows stretched across the prairie. The cowboy gathered a few sticks and built a small fire, moving with quiet efficiency. When she tried to help, he simply shook his head, not unkindly, telling her without words that she should rest. She watched him from the blanket he'd given her, noticing the faint white scars along his knuckles and forearms. Old wounds, healed long ago, but never forgotten. She wondered what battles he'd fought, what wrongs he'd tried to right. She didn't ask. Somehow, she felt she already knew. Night settled in slow and quiet, the fire crackling softly in the dark. Above them, the stars spilled across the sky in 1,000 pinpricks of light. Mary felt the weight of the day easing from her shoulders. The pain in her back still throbbed, but the terror had faded. For the first time in a long while, she felt safe. When she drifted off to sleep, the cowboy was still sitting by the fire, his gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the flames, like a man keeping watch over more than just the night. The next morning, the air was cool and still. Mary stirred awake to find the spot beside the fire empty. The cowboy's horse was gone. In its place, resting beside her on the folded blanket, was his hat and a small scrap of paper. She picked up the note, her hands trembling. The handwriting was plain and blocky, as if carved by the same steady hand that had cut her free. It held only 3 words, "You are free." Her throat tightened. She looked out at the endless horizon, the prairie stretching far in every direction. A soft wind stirred the grass, carrying with it the scent of morning and the promise of a new day. She smiled through her tears, clutching the note in her hand. Redemption Creek was behind her now, and somewhere out there, riding under the same sky, was the silent cowboy, the man who had never spoken a single word, yet had told her everything she needed to hear.